Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. He followed a map they burned. They said he discovered it, that he was the first, that he sailed into the unknown, guided only by stars, courage, and divine fate, that he crossed a flat world, defied every mapmaker, and stumbled into a new world no one had ever seen before. But that's not the truth, not even close, because long before Columbus set foot on a Spanish dock, someone had already been here. And Columbus? He didn't sail blind. He didn't guess. He didn't discover anything. He followed something they weren't supposed to talk about. A map. A map they later tried to burn. But stories like that, real stories, don't stay buried. Not for long, especially when they change everything. Long before 1492, the world was already in motion. While Europe was dragging itself out of the Middle Ages, other civilizations were thriving, building, exploring, recording, mapping. In Timbuktu, scholars studied astronomy and mathematics in libraries that held books older than anything in Europe. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom had preserved ancient Greek science and Indian philosophy for centuries. In China, fleets of massive treasure ships, led by Admiral Zheng He, crossed oceans with maps that charted the stars. And in West Africa, legends spoke of men who sailed across the sea and never returned, not lost, but transformed. One of those legends would haunt history forever. The story of Abu Bakr II, Emperor of Mali. In the early 1300s, he ruled one of the richest kingdoms on earth, a land of gold, scholars, and towering cities like Niani. But he wasn't content with wealth. He wanted knowledge. So he gave up his throne, built a fleet of 2,000 ships, and set sail into the Atlantic. Most historians laughed it off, called it a myth. But oral traditions in both West Africa and parts of the Caribbean tell the same tale. That black-skinned sailors arrived long before Columbus, that they spoke strange languages, brought gifts, and vanished into the forest, that they left behind symbols, in stone, in song, in memory. Columbus didn't ignore these stories. He studied them. He spent time in Portuguese ports where African sailors whispered of lands across the sea. He spoke with cartographers who showed him maps that had no Christian cross on them, only coastlines, stars, and cities written in languages he couldn't read. And he wasn't alone. In the royal courts of Spain, there were rumors that someone had already been there, that the Moors, expelled from Granada, had once possessed charts of distant lands across the ocean, that Jewish scholars, forced to flee, had preserved maps older than the Bible, and that in the vaults of Venice, Genoa, and Cordoba, ancient knowledge waited to be stolen, copied, or silenced. Among the most mysterious was the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It showed parts of South America and even the Antarctic coast in shocking detail, and Piri Reis himself claimed it was based on ancient maps. Some drawn by Arabs, others, he said, by a Genoese infidel, likely Columbus himself, who had access to older documents no longer in existence. But where did he get them? That's the question they tried to erase. Because if Columbus used maps, if he wasn't discovering but retracing, then the whole myth of European supremacy collapses. Spain needed a hero, the church needed proof of divine favor, and Europe needed an excuse. Discovery gave them all three, so they buried the truth. Letters that referenced strange charts were locked away. Testimonies from sailors about other lands already known were dismissed. And those who remembered? They were silenced. But fragments survived. A document from 1485 references a conversation between Columbus and a Portuguese pilot who claimed to have sailed west until he struck green land with rivers and dark men. Another letter, ignored for centuries, records a monk's claim that maps of the Western Sea exist among the infidels, but they speak of them only in shadow. And Columbus himself, in a letter to Queen Isabella, admits something strange. "I found lands with names already known among sailors from the south. Their maps resemble the coasts we now claim." Why would he say that? Why would he describe rivers, mountains, and ports that don't appear on any European map? Unless they were on someone else's. Unless he followed something he wasn't supposed to have. And maybe that's why he was so obsessed, so relentless, so eager not just to explore, but to own. Because he wasn't chasing a myth. He was chasing proof, and once he had it, he wanted it silenced. When he returned from his first voyage, he didn't bring just gold or people, he brought control. He renamed the islands, he renamed the people, and he renamed the story. He claimed to have found India, claimed to have discovered new worlds, claimed to have walked where no Christian had stepped before. And the crown believed him, or pretended to, because it gave them what they wanted, a blank slate, a land without history, a people without memory, a world they could shape, claim, and convert. But that world was never blank. It had been drawn long before, in carvings on stones in Mali, in Polynesian stick maps charting Pacific currents, in Arab star maps etched on camel skin, in songs passed down for generations by people who never called themselves lost. And the greatest secret? Columbus's own maps, the ones he used to sail west, disappeared. After his death, they were locked away, destroyed, burned, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. And they proved the story wasn't his. He was a messenger, a thief of knowledge, a man who followed footprints and called them his own. And when the world began to believe his version, they didn't just bury the map, they buried the people who drew it. But memory doesn't die, and the past doesn't forget, especially when it was stolen, before Columbus ever touched a ship's wheel, before Spain gave him ships, before the world pretended the ocean was unknown. There was an empire, one most history books barely mention, but without it, Columbus may never have crossed the sea. This was the Mali Empire, not a fable, not a rumor, a superpower in its time. From the 1200s through the 1600s, Mali controlled the gold, salt, and knowledge flowing through West Africa. Its cities gleamed under the desert sun. Its scholars debated astronomy, theology, and medicine. Its kings, known as mansas, commanded armies, fleets, and ideas. And in 1311, a king named Abubakar II made a decision that would be erased from most of the world. He gave up his throne, not in weakness, but in vision. He believed the Atlantic wasn't the end of the world. He believed the ocean was a river, and that rivers always led somewhere. And so he launched the greatest expedition the world had seen at that time. A fleet of 2,000 ships, equipped with food, water, gold, rowers, interpreters. A floating city of explorers, knowledge seekers, and risk-takers. He never returned. European scholars scoffed. They called it myth, convenient folklore. No records, they claimed, but they weren't looking in the right places. The records were there. In Mali's oral history, the griots, storytellers whose memories held centuries, they speak of Abubakar's ships, of the preparations, of the long goodbye, and of the silence that followed. And then, evidence began to surface. Carvings in South America, African faces, styles, metallurgy, traces of West African DNA in pre-Columbian Caribbean remains, plants native to Africa found growing in coastal regions of Brazil, and in Haiti, stories passed down through generations of black men who came from the sea before the white ones did. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a crossing. And Columbus? He learned about it. In his time in Portugal, years before 1492, he spent time in Cape Verde, the islands off West Africa, a key trading hub, a place where Arab and African sailors shared maps the church didn't approve of. He worked with cartographers who used Islamic maritime tools, studied stars the Vatican refused to name, and more than once he wrote about a powerful black kingdom whose ships had sailed westward long ago. So why doesn't anyone talk about that? Because history likes its heroes simple, and Columbus was easier to sell if he was brave, original, and white. But what if he was none of those things? What if he took the methods of Mali, the wisdom of Muslim navigation, and the knowledge of African crossings, and rebranded them? Let's be clear. The Moors, Muslims who ruled parts of Spain for over 700 years, had introduced Europe to astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and yes, navigation. They brought compasses, astrolabes, sailing techniques developed along African coasts. They passed down ancient Greek texts preserved through Islamic translation. They built schools in Granada, libraries in Seville, and port cities in Cadiz, where Columbus studied. And when the Spanish Reconquista pushed them out, they didn't take the knowledge with them. They left it behind, on purpose or not, embedded in the very places Columbus learned. So when he plotted his famous voyage, he didn't invent the idea. He was assembling pieces of a puzzle that others had already drawn centuries before. He took Moorish star charts. He used African wind current observations. He followed maps kept in Jewish, Arab, and outlawed collections. And then he gave it all a new name, Discovery. The empire that taught him how to cross the sea, they weren't recognized. They were erased. Mali was already fading by the time Spain took the spotlight. Internal power struggles, external invasions, colonial pressure creeping across West Africa. But before it fell, it had already launched men across the sea. And what did Columbus bring back? Not thanks, not credit, but silence. He didn't name Abubakari. He didn't speak of the African sources. He presented his voyage as divine intervention, a Christian miracle, a new world for the Spanish crown. And Spain needed that. They had just expelled the Moors. They had outlawed Arabic. They had forced conversions on Jews and Muslims alike. Admitting that their national hero learned to cross the ocean from black Muslim sailors? Impossible. So they rewrote it, made it cleaner, simpler, whiter. But the cracks are there, in Columbus's own journals. He describes natives who had metal-tipped spears made of a metal not from the islands. He describes them wearing cotton clothing similar to what he saw in Africa. He describes canoes larger than European ships, with navigation skills equal to or surpassing his own. He wasn't shocked. He was comparing, because he'd heard about it all before. He just didn't expect it to still be there, and he feared it. Because if these people had knowledge, maps, trade routes, diplomacy, then Spain couldn't call it a discovery. They couldn't own it. So he changed the script. He called the people savages. He reported their gold. He made himself the first. And when the crown asked how he got there, he smiled and handed them a different map. Columbus had returned, not alone and not quietly. He arrived in Spain as if the heavens had parted. Banners waved, bells rang, priests wept. They said he'd brought proof of God's favor, gold, exotic plants, people unlike any ever seen before. But what he brought more than anything was power. The crown didn't see a map. They saw a weapon. And when Columbus presented the parchment, tattered, sea-worn, etched with coastlines no Spaniard had drawn before, they leaned in. But they didn't see it for what it was. They didn't see a guide. They saw a threat. Because the map wasn't Spanish, it wasn't Christian, it wasn't born in a cathedral or royal court. It didn't even match the official charts of the time. It was older, it was smarter, and worst of all, it didn't come from them. The map Columbus used, or rather the fragments of it he'd assembled, didn't come from imagination. It came from memory, borrowed memory, stolen memory. Pieces from Moorish star maps, Arabic port logs smuggled out of Cordoba, fragments of oral navigation systems from African sailors who never got their names in any book, copied, traced, and redrawn in secret. It proved that someone else had crossed the sea long before Columbus claimed the title. And that was dangerous. Because if the world found out that Muslims, Jews, or Africans had mapped the Atlantic first, Spain's claim would crack. The Pope's decree would lose weight. The empire would start to look like a lie. And so, the order came down. Burn it. The map, the notes, the testimonies. All of it. Anything that pointed to a world before 1492 had to be silenced. Witnesses were discredited. Charts were confiscated. Whole collections of Moorish cartography, centuries of knowledge, were torched in public squares. And Columbus? He stayed quiet. He had secured his place, his funding, his title, his myth. All he had to do was play along. So he called the lands Indies, even though they weren't. He called the people Indians, even though they weren't. He told the Queen the voyage had been a miracle, not a map, a revelation, not a route. The world swallowed it. History crowned him, and the truth was reduced to ash. But some pages survived, hidden in monasteries, locked in private libraries in Istanbul and Venice, passed down by scholars who knew the fire was coming. One letter, now held in a museum in Cairo, references a Spanish mariner who sought maps known to the Moors of Al-Andalus. Another, found in an old Portuguese logbook, names Columbus directly. He came to us with questions, not about wind or wave, but about where others had already gone. It was never about discovering. It was about following, and then erasing. And look, if you've made it this far, you probably feel the heat. Because the more you hear, the harder it is to unhear. So let me pause right here, just for a second, and talk to you, listener. I'm Uncle Luke, and I tell the stories they tried to bury. And this one they buried deep. So if it hit you, if it made you pause, if it cracked something open, hit that like button. Drop a comment. Tell me what they never taught you in school. Subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells, because this isn't the last map they burned. And we've got more smoke to chase. Now, let's go back. Because the fire is still burning, the Spanish crown began rewriting documents. They funded expeditions not to find new lands, but to overwrite the ones already known. Whole maps were redrawn, histories rewritten, names erased. Cartographers were ordered to follow approved shapes. Islands that once appeared on Moorish charts vanished. Coastlines were stretched, compressed, renamed. The official story was stamped 1492, the year the world began. But off the record, there were cracks. A few daring scribes in Lisbon and Fez whispered about the truth. A monk in Sicily kept a backup of an old Arabic chart. It vanished from the archive in 1521. A Jesuit navigator in Goa copied a set of African trade winds from a forbidden ledger. He was later excommunicated. The fire didn't just destroy maps. It destroyed people. Scholars who had preserved knowledge through centuries were hunted. African sailors who spoke of voyages west were accused of witchcraft. Even within Spain, anyone with a Moorish or Jewish lineage was suspect, because the lie only worked if no one lived to contradict it. And Columbus? He grew quiet, older, more paranoid. By his third voyage, he wasn't celebrated. He was questioned. By his fourth, he was arrested, brought back to Spain in chains, not for lying, but for telling too much. In one of his final letters, he wrote, "I am not the first to cross these waters, only the first they allowed to be remembered." That line never made it into the textbooks, but it should have, because that's the whole story. Columbus didn't discover America. He didn't stumble into history. He walked straight into a world someone else had already mapped and claimed it as his own. Then he helped set fire to the truth.